Hey, Erin.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Hi. It's still morning, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I love the idea of this panel because I think for a long time in Kubernetes and especially storage, we've been really talking in the theoretical. And I love that we have customers and we have people using it and we can talk about lessons learned. We can share our experiences, our use cases, and talk about how these are solved in the real world. So if my panelists will come up, and if you guys just want to give a short introduction of who you are and who you work for. I work for Red Hat in the CTO office, and Lisa Marie's already introduced me, so I'll just go ahead. Whoever wants to start, go ahead.
So my name is Yaniv Katz. I'm the Director of Cloud Infrastructure in LivePerson.
I'm Ritu Sharma from Duke Energy, an IT architect.
Jason Presnell, you saw me up here earlier. I get the privilege to be up here twice, so thank you.
Hi, Satish Puranam from Ford Motor Company. I'm the technical lead for all things containers at Ford.
Great. All right, so kind of the first question is, what are your use cases for cloud native? Why is what you're doing in your work cloud native a requirement?
So I think I will start. We did a quite big transition from the VM world to the Kubernetes. We are running Kubernetes in quite a big scale for 2 years now. I think that the change that we saw was on the developer side, which we need to provide, which have more capabilities and is enabled to do much more on on the Kubernetes platform. So we noticed that we need to provide among the toolbox that Kubernetes provide, we also need to bring in the storage inside of the platform.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. Adding to that, our customer-facing applications, as business grows, we need to, that's the missing link. We have been sort of managing it, whatever manage is called, multiple tasks, manual tasks to do that. But this CNS with automation, what you saw, it just provides us that missing link for our HA and active applications.
Sure. As Jason was mentioning earlier, I think our cloud native journey started with Cloud Foundry. We're still a big Cloud Foundry shop, but we wanted to provide the same kind of agility that cloud native applications enjoy, but for the hard things, data services, messaging services. So that's where our journey started with Kubernetes and a lot of storage providers. We tried pretty much everything out there, from Rook to Gluster to Portworx that we are working with right now, and NetApp. So our journey primarily in Kubernetes area has been concentrating on stateful things. And we're very fortunate to work with Red Hat as well, particularly on the operator parts. So I think we believe that's what made us successful so far, and we're looking forward to actually scaling it up ahead much better, I guess.
Right. You're good, Jason? Okay, perfect. So, taking that step of taking what we traditionally, how we run applications, and then moving them to the cloud is obviously the first step. And then you guys mentioned, the stateful aspects of it. Can you guys describe a very specific use case you're focused on, either accelerating or getting even to work on this platform because of the statefulness of storage?
I think that accelerating is the key word here, because it's really how fast you can bring the service into the production. What is the enablement that you bring to the developer in order to be able to self-manage the stored resources by himself? Because back in the days, when you need into the traditional environment, when the developer needs to run a stateful application, he will go to the system administrator and ask to allocate a chunk of disk for him and this and that. And this is time consuming. This is keep the business behind. And in the Kubernetes, that of course is this is the enablement or deployment enablement environment. This is where we are focusing on. This is the key value that we see when bringing this into the platform.
So yeah, we have a very specific use case. We have, as I mentioned, big WebSphere customers we have WebSphere 6.1, which got retired like what, 10 years, 8 some years ago. We still have some apps running over there, some critical apps, and the reason we were not able to move is just they are stateful apps, and they had to, rewrite and all that. But that's the thing I talked about, lift and shift, right? Kubernetes, the cards applications, the lift and shift. And that, if you can bring the data application, if you can bring all that, that just makes it so much easier. So we were able to take our very old application running on an unsupported platform, very business critical applications, and we were able to package in Kubernetes, in containers, and were able to deploy on our Devanti platform.
Yeah, for our target, as we mentioned before, we're big in Cloud Foundry for a long time, and there's a developer expectation as well that we can turn around things really quickly. CF push, done, right? My code's done. So having that same level of expectation carry over to Kubernetes is a big thing for us, is how do we be able to provide that component? A primary use case we have, at least in our Kubernetes platform now, are CI/CD pipelines, and again, data services, marching into database, into cache, into messaging, and so on and so forth. So being able to have the enablement on that platform, the orchestration piece, both as a consistent player on-prem, but also off-prem, right? So our first foray into Kubernetes was on-prem, not into the cloud. And that tends to be a little different than the stories I usually hear, is they start off-prem first. But we did it on-prem to get that consistency and get that speed and give some of the things that were shown here earlier, like across data center type functionalities and stuff like that. But really, Kubernetes is the orchestration platform going forward for us. So trying to bring along the ease of use that we have with our existing environments into this one as well. And we're just like any other enterprise. We have a lot of legacy applications. WebSphere is one of those. We've been a WebSphere shop for a long time. What do you do about those types of customers, right? So.
You already covered it. All right. So I think it's pretty telling how you guys talk about your journey with Kubernetes, but then you're wanting what the meat of what these storage platforms offer. If you could say, if I could have this feature in Kubernetes storage to be a native function of it, what would that be?
So I think that when you look at the industry today, there are quite few solutions for storage for Kubernetes. There are some traditional companies that transform and adopt themselves to be able to cope with the Kubernetes showing up like in a big scale and everywhere. And there are a few new companies that are more focused on bringing the storage in more native way into the Kubernetes cluster. And this is what we are looking for, because it's working for our perspective in better way. It be able to manage, we are able to manage like using good things in the Kubernetes scheduler and other good things that are bind together there. So we are looking for the solution that are more natives into the platforms.
So what we are sort of looking at, I mean, we always look at, right, the third data center or off-prem, the burst. If you have a need, for our outage management system, you always plan the capacity, right? you try to do a good job with capacity, but it's always that uphill battle, right? From the operations side of things, we need to manage our capacity ahead, maybe 3 to 6 months ahead. So the way sort of I look at it, if we have another EKS cluster or AKS cluster running on Kubernetes that we can load balance off-prem and on-prem and on burst as needed, utilize that. So how do you handle your storage needs, right? The latency to me is the part where you do sort of need to think through how you bring data closer, obviously, to the applications, data in the containers with the storage, big part of that, not just your on-prem, your off-prem, and seamlessly be able to load balance across all tiers and all locations.
Yeah, I'll mirror my panel mate here. Is workload mobility of the storage is got to be the hardest thing in my mind to accomplish. We also have similar thoughts about how do we burst from on-prem to off-prem and back and forth. Doing the application workload is easy enough, but how do you take the data? How do you make it seamless, right? And being able to give that with a guarantee that you can move back and forth between the two. There's so many different things. It's really hard to be able to pull that off, I think. And storage is usually the last problem that we're never able to solve. Right? We'll run it here, we'll run it there, but we're not going to move it because, oh my gosh, that's just way too hard, right? So I think workable mobility and doing that natively in Kubernetes stably is key.
I think what I would think about is what I think the CSI spec is working towards it, the topology-aware storage. So we would like to move the workloads to the storage, not the other way around, because moving other way around is extremely expensive, both in terms of time, latency, and various other things. So what we would like to see is, can we pre-provision certain pieces of storage or data, and can I direct Kubernetes API server towards scheduling the workloads on those nodes? So rather than moving data around, let's move the workloads around. So that is much more efficient. CSI spec is working on it, but we will see what would be the actual implementations of it. I'm looking forward for it.
Great, thank you. So one interesting thing that you guys have all kind of touched on but haven't come out loud and said, maybe you did in your earlier presentations today though, is the need for having multiple clouds or hybrid clouds. Is that key to your workloads being able to run efficiently, is being able to support that? And how do you work around, even the network latency? We talk about cost with storage, but how are you guys addressing the network latency with storage?
So I think that with regards to cloud, moving data between clouds, it's really interesting use cases, but people they are talking about it, but I don't know how much is actually do it and shift data between clouds, because I think that there are still some things to solve in order to do it in a safe way, because it is our data. We need to understand how the security looks like, how the encryption looks like, because if we are using type A of cloud that encrypt the data, how do you move to another cloud provider if you need to move? So I think that this is still something that the community, the industry will need to solve in a solid way in order for the enterprise organization will really adopt it and do it.
Yeah, so I think the problems that we are facing, because we had to sell all that to our management, to our other operational support teams, which is just, we all know, is the hardest part, right? We can get things done, but it's all that layer. So how do we sell it? We sold it. It's a stretch cluster for us. Telecom, they don't like it. They were able to work with us. But that's where some of the innovations and some of the forward thinking has to play a role there, right? That's why we rely on bright minds and some, we bring on the business side, bring our need, and that's what I have tried to do. I have tried to go to our customers that we used throughout, and I said, this is what we are implementing. I have this need. Can you work with me to solve this, right? In this case, telecom, with layer 2, they do not like layer 2 stretch all that, but they were able to provide that. Maybe, with the layer 3, you can do some of those missing links, right? You can provide the replication, you can provide all that, and still be able to bring your support people in place, right? When your application is down, data center is down, everyone's sitting in the hot room with SDEs, triage going on. That is what we are looking for, right? That is what we need to solve. We can all feel good about we implemented something. But the real need is when you are sitting in that situation, how to avoid and how to plan ahead and how to work all that out.
Yeah, I think for us, the answer to the original question was it's not critical yet. We definitely have workloads that work on-prem. We definitely have workloads that work off-prem. And we kind of segregate our structures in that way on some level of criteria, say burstability or public internet facing where we want to do CDNs, things like that. But going forward, we have a multi-cloud strategy. I try not to use the word hybrid because that means so many different things to so many different people. Some people automatically jump to an interconnected network that you can move storage and move all your workloads back and forth. That all depends, right? A hybrid strategy could also be control plane controls it all, but the data components stay local and resident. So our next, I would say, phase of how Ford is handling IT is we still have an on-prem investment that we want to capitalize on and make full effective use. But being able to run in the cloud to be closer to some of our suppliers, to have certain capabilities is also key. So how do we deliver them all together? So we feel with Kubernetes, again, gives us that consistent experience between the two overall.
One way to answer the original question was that way we are thinking about is, like, as I said, moving the data closer to the workloads, asynchronously preferably, and leveraging object storage technologies wherever possible. So that way we don't have to be restricted to the limits or the bounds of POSIX, because I believe POSIX is the fundamental block which is actually holding storage back. But it is also required. If you look at a lot of traditional databases, they will not talk to anything non-POSIX or something like that. But if we can abstract it at the storage layer, that's what we are working on towards these days, is can we abstract enough at the storage tier that we can move storage around between on-prem locations or in public cloud, leveraging object storage as a means of transport, because otherwise we would have to start punching holes through the firewalls. So object storage provides that neat interface as well. So that's an evolving thinking right now. I don't think we are there yet at saying that we are synchronizing data in real time. But yet we do understand data has a gravity, and there is a thing called a speed of light. So you have to work within those things.
Right. And so on your point about data gravity and the portability of workloads, what are you guys doing in-house to address automation of that data policy? Because it's not really native to Kubernetes now.
Well, with Portworx, we'll have some of that ability, right? So there'll be data gravity there, so slight plug, so there you go. That's what we're looking at overall. We kind of have, our approach is we have infrastructure servers, right? So that kind of is opposite of every node having storage that you can do, where several of the products here can do that. But we're looking at how we move that closer overall, both from a performance standpoint. We do have several customers that are that way, where they're very keen on fast throughput, high IOPS, but you have others that are not. So again, we're just trying to figure that out.
Did you want to add to that?
I think the challenge is always figuring out, do you want to consistency or availability?
Of course.
Right, so
We
you
want it
cannot
all.
have both. And it all depends upon the workload that you're trying to run on top of it, which typically dictates it. Fortunately, many of the messaging systems or data services handle storage replication at the application tier. In that case, you don't have to rely that much on the infrastructure. As long as you provide blocks of storage someplace they can write to. For such kind of use cases, I would say existing storage providers does okay job. But I think the important thing becomes is that what do you do is there a one universal control plane? I think probably not. A lot of folks are working towards it, but the whole problem of data gravity cannot be just be solved like that. So one way to solve it is like thinking differently. If everything speaks object storage, that becomes one way to think about it, but then we have too much legacy, 140 years of legacy at Ford. We're not going to write away 140 years of apps and history just by saying we're going to go to object storage.
Right.
But there is, I guess it's all about vendors, community, and everybody participating in trying to do what is the next thing.
I agree.
Yeah, I think that was one of the reasons, as I talked about in our journey, is hyperconverged is something that made sense to us, especially containers in general. We thought about is, do we, of course there are use cases for everything, do we want hypervisor layer in the middle? Do we want the VMs running the containers on top of the blades, multiple, how the performance and all that and how all that is impacted. But to answer that question, that the hyperconverged, because compute being in there as you do your edge computing and your IoTs and things like that, that's how we were trying to solve one way for us. I think it did provide something what we were looking for. So.
No, I think it's...
All right, so we have lunch in 5 minutes. So what I want to do is, since this panel was about best practices for deploying and not necessarily the future, could you guys give one piece of advice for someone running their stateful app on Kubernetes? And if you had to say, this was the thing that really got us, that was very challenging, and if, as you're moving your either legacy apps or you're starting new things, here is the single piece of advice I would give someone.
So what works for us is we are looking at, I call it the golden triangle. It's like when you come to look for a good solution, it's to look at the security aspect, the scalability, and the stability of the solution. And another thing that I would like to add is that, again, there is a lot of solution out there. I think that what worked for us is to try to look for the common denominator that work for most of the use case and go with that instead of just pick and choose for each use cases because it doesn't scale and it's really hard to manage.
Yeah, one piece of advice is really, I think the first is the how to get started. I think that's really what we are looking at. So for our stateful apps, again, making sure that your backend is responsive in the time. You are bringing your data closer to your applications. You are planning ahead. You are sort of standardizing your things. Your CI/CD processes, working towards on the DevOps side. On the operation side, you're providing that operational efficiency and capacity planning. I mean, that sort of puts together, and that's why we feel we have been successful in doing that. So yeah.
So I know you said one thing, but I have a slight multi-part answer.
That's okay.
What I would say is know your customers that you're building for, right? Know what they want and make it as easy as possible for them to consume. More often than not, as a platform operator, I have a big background in operational thing, not as a developer. I always kind of think, well, I think my users need this. Well, why do I think that? Why don't I just go ask them, right? What will work for you, right? And developers can be a finicky crowd. They may want this one day, may want this another day. But in the end, knowing your customers and being able to deliver it to them in a very easily consumable way is really key. And I think a lot of us as technologists tend to miss that sometimes.
Right.
I think I will leave it with a very specific technical piece of advice is like use Kubernetes features, things like affinity, anti-affinity rules. If you are having a stateful workload, spread them across multiple AZs possibly. You must spread them across multiple AZs. Define HPAs when possible. Use basic primitives like stateful sets appropriately. All of these helps you because now loss of a data center or a hosting location does not preclude that your app is seeing a downtime, right? So that would be the best piece of advice because there are a lot of pieces in Kubernetes that are available there. But I think the other thing would be is that how are you going to actually wrestle the underlying storage to be conformant with that? So that those would be that like
best practices, in my opinion.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.